debate, and so you were kind of looking at both.
For me, it was like the last test. It was like if I can like make it through this debate and win, or at least present a reasonable case, I'm converting to Orthodoxy. And the overwhelming, I mean, every neutral party said I won that debate. There were even Roman Catholics saying I won that debate.
Papal supremacy. What was your approach? Did you like read a bunch of books? Did you watch a lot of YouTube videos? And what did you end up finding like were the most convincing arguments for you?
Yeah, so I read. I basically devoted my life to studying the papacy for like 3, I think a little over 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah, I skimmed. I had to have skimmed probably a dozen books. When I read, I skim because I'm looking for very specific information on very specific things. One of the tactics I use though is I listen to everything there is on YouTube from Eric Ibarra. I listen to every single talking point that the best papal apologist has to offer. And I made sure that I had a response to everything he said. And I did similar things with Swan. Swan's arguments I don't find as convincing because he usually just goes from the scriptures. And I think whenever anyone's arguing typology from the scriptures, I think it's cringe because like it's almost insulting to like the Eastern Orthodox position to think that like we were the same church for 1,000 years. You don't think we have a reasonable interpretation of these passages?
Yeah.
Like it's almost insulting when you use those type of arguments. So I find the church, and I would say that most neutral parties find the church history arguments much more convincing. So that's where I spent most of my time.
That was definitely part of my departure from Rome, was seeing the contradictions, especially like pre and post Vatican I. It's way different, and then you compare that to the first millennium, and it's just Vatican I is not taught in the first millennium. If you're reading the early canons of the councils, if you're hearing about situations like Pope Vigilius and Pope Honorius, and all these, clear as day example where the early church did not have this Vatican I papal supremacy view. And,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say that the Vatican I definition shoots itself in the foot because it says it's been known since the beginning of the Christian religion. And this is something that I made really clear in my opening statement of the debate is this is your burden of proof because it's the burden of proof that your council gave you. And so if you're going to defend Vatican I, you have to defend the claims it makes about authority irreformable of itself and not from the consent of the church, and that this has been known since the beginning of the Christian religion. That's what you have to defend because that's the claims that Vatican I says. And a lot of people don't realize Dictatus Papae in 1090 made similar claims. I mean, Vatican I wasn't this massive innovation that a lot of people think it was. It was pretty shortly after the schism that you had claims similar to Vatican I being made by Rome. So it really is not exclusive to Vatican I. It's just that Vatican I is the one that finally made it dogmatic.
Yeah. And so what pieces of evidence do you think are the strongest? Like I brought up a few, but what specific pieces of evidence do you think disprove the like papal supremacy argument?
Yeah. So there's some obvious ones. I mean, everybody loves Constantinople too.
Yeah.
I mean, I will always start there because I want to hear them say the bishops were wrong. That's why I want to hear it come out of their mouth. Because they have to. They literally have to say the bishops at Constantinople II were wrong. You have to say it. If you're a Roman Catholic, there's no way around it. That's what you have to say. So I always make sure whenever I'm talking to a Roman Catholic that knows what they're talking about, I make sure that that comes out of their mouth. Another thing is, and I after rewatching the debate, I'm upset with myself that I let him get away with this. Lateran 649 buries the Roman Catholic position because their claim is that if a pope makes a council ecumenical, it's ecumenical. Lateran 649 was intended by the Pope, by two separate popes, to be ecumenical. And not only was it not recognized as ecumenical by the East, it's not even acknowledged at Constantinople III. And when I pointed this out in the cross exam, he was flipping through his book trying to find a quotation that supposedly says that it was referenced at Constantinople III. No, it wasn't. And I should have stayed there for the rest of my cross exam and let him try to find the quotation because it's not there. It's not there. Lateran 649 was not recognized by anyone, especially not an ecumenical council after the fact. And so if that's your definition of ecumenical council, he was criticizing my definition of an ecumenical council the whole time. But if your definition of an ecumenical council is a pope has to affirm it as ecumenical, then it fails with Lateran 649 alone.
Yeah.
The position fails.
Yeah.
And then there was a point that I think a lot of people missed during his cross exam of me, and it was he was pressing me on Canon 28 of Chalcedon, and he was pointing out that Pope Leo had rejected the canon, but that another pope in 869 accepted the canon. But what do we always hear about what popes can and can't change? They can't change sacred tradition, right?
Yeah.
Well, what is more sacred in tradition than the canons of ecumenical councils? The only thing more sacred in tradition than the canons of an ecumenical council is literally scripture. That's it. That's the only thing more sacred. But you, in your desperate attempt to prove that a pope can pick and choose what canons he likes, you've completely thrown out sacred tradition as even existing. Because you're arguing now that 400 years after Chalcedon, this canon was just randomly accepted when it was denied by that pope at the time.
Yeah.
So those were I would say those are the three big ones from the debate that I would say are big points. I mean, I brought up a bunch of them. There's so many, dude. Oh, another one actually. The Meletian Schism single-handedly proves that you do not need to be in communion with Rome to be in communion with the true church, which is their whole talking point. That's their whole argument. If there is such thing as a church that can be the true church and not in communion with Rome, then your whole argument as a Roman Catholic crumbles.
Yeah.
And just real quick, one last point on this. One of the things that I think separates the Roman Catholic arguments from the Eastern Orthodox arguments is the Roman Catholics are extremely dependent upon these quotes from ecumenical councils like Pope St. Agatho, his letter. It has to be taken literally. It has to literally mean the See of Rome has never erred and it never will err. And St. Maximus has to literally mean you have to be in communion with Rome in order to be in the communion of the church. It has to be literal, and it has to be the same from now until the end of time. That's what their argument is completely dependent upon. Our arguments are based on how how it actually went down in the first millennium. Yeah. The Meletian Schism is evidence that these quotes are not literal. They're honoring the Bishop of Rome. Yes. We see the same thing with the emperor. So if you're going to say it's literal for the Pope, it has to be literal for the emperor. Yeah. When it applies in Matthew 16 to the emperor, Yeah. So that's what I would say distinguishes the Eastern Orthodox position from the Roman Catholic position is we're dependent only on how it actually went down, not on some random quote mines.
Yeah, exactly. And I hear so many different things from different Catholics. Like some of them will say, "Oh, the Vatican I view was in the first millennium. It was always present." And then some of them will say, "Oh, actually, it's a seed and it developed." Yeah. And they'll cite Matthew, but then we don't see the Church Fathers having that interpretation. It's all these different stories. And then also, Ubi Petrus does a lot of great work on refuting Catholicism. And he brought up all the forgeries that Rome relied on, which I think really hurts their case. So it's like all these together is just not a consistent story, and all the things you brought up really just make it hard to, like, why would you become Catholic and not Orthodox? Especially when, I don't know if you got into like Vatican II in the past like 70 years, but, basically they just kind of contradicted, all their teachings. Like, I mean, even before that, they used to dogmatically teach at Florence that there is no salvation outside the church, right. Even if you've shed blood. But they have canonized saints that have died outside the church. Even some of our pillars of orthodoxy, like, I mean, Gregory Palamas is venerated in the Eastern Catholic Church. Pope Francis canonized a Armenian saint and made him a doctor of the church. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. How could you be a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church when you're Armenian who was never in communion? It's just clear as day contradiction.
I mean, just on the topic of Saint Mark of Ephesus too. Yeah. I mean, like, Saint Mark of Ephesus says things that like Rome is from Satan. Yeah. I mean, it's just absurd to me that you can say that you're in communion with Rome and venerate someone like Saint Mark of Ephesus.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, exactly. And then just seeing the average experience at your local Catholic church is totally different than what you're going to get at an Orthodox church. The Novus Ordo, which is the mass that 99% of the Catholic Church has, it's just a neo-Protestant liturgy. It's got all the Protestant songs. It's not very reverent. Versus going to the Divine Liturgy, it's just like, wow, this place feels holy. This is reverent. And so, how was that for you, like going to the Divine Liturgy for the first time?
Yeah, hard to put into words. So my first Divine Liturgy I went to, I was not really inquiring into Orthodoxy. My
Yeah.
wife and I went to Father Josiah's church,
Oh wow.
because it's only about 2 hours from where we live, and so we were like, oh, we should go. You know, this guy's famous,
Yeah.
and we left like just in absolute shock. I mean, just it's hard to I would say, as someone who criticized Nicaea 2 as adamantly as I did, I never criticized Nicaea 2 after actually watching like what veneration looks like.
Yes.
And then I would say the biggest difference between Divine Liturgy and, I guess, the Roman Catholics kind of have this, but I'll talk about that in a minute. What distinguishes us from them in liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
but is the centrality of the Eucharist. It's very clear that like the culminating event is the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is nothing that is distracting from the Eucharist. Like
Yeah.
it is that is like the culminating event of worship when you go to Divine Liturgy. And I would say too, just being surrounded by all the iconography.
Mm-hmm.
I had never even heard this argument before from an Orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
but immediately as a Protestant, when I was in that church, I immediately thought of Hebrews 12:1. Immediately thought of being surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I was like, I am literally surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses.
Yeah.
And one of the things that went in my head at that moment was, man, I want my future children to experience this. Like I want my future children to be surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses that they can emulate their life after, and they can know that we have 2,000 years of history that they're standing on.
Yeah.
And that it's not just this empty, Jesus loves you. He died. Like that's that's the beginning. That's what it's all built on. But there's all this stuff that came, as a result of Jesus saving you and dying for you, and that none of that's talked about. I mean, the vast majority of Protestants can't name a single saint after the Apostle John. Like they can't name a single one. And I was that way growing up in the church. So as far as distinguishing the liturgy from the Roman Catholics, I actually attended a Latin Mass.
Yeah. I used to be trad Catholic. So
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. So exactly what I'm about to say. But when I attended a Latin Mass with my wife's family, I was expecting something akin to Divine Liturgy. I was like thinking it was going to be, something similar to like what I'd experienced at Divine Liturgy. I don't know how else to describe it other than like a cheap ripoff. Like they had, it was a Christmas service. They had like the top choir in the area. It was, there was, first of all, no iconography. There was a few statues. There was a few statues of the Theotokos, but there was not one icon that I can remember. Maybe a few that were just like hanging on the wall, small ones.
Yeah.
Nothing like an Orthodox church. And yeah, it just felt like empty, whereas the Divine Liturgy feels otherworldly. I mean, you literally feel like you're experiencing a piece of heaven when you're in Divine Liturgy. And I think part of it too is like last week we had a liturgy on Saturday last week, and it was only a few people there, but there's an aspect to liturgy that it's always the same, but when your heart is there, you're going to experience it in a unique way.
Yeah.
And even though it was, just a Saturday liturgy, not a lot of people there, that was one of the most powerful liturgies I've ever been in.
Yeah.
And that the crazy thing is, like, that's every liturgy. It's just like, are you there? Is your heart, is your heart there? Are you there to worship?
Definitely.
So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think you covered a lot of amazing points. I mean, even in the Latin Mass, it falls into the trilingual heresy, where I saw that a lot of trad Catholics, they have like this obsession with Latin. They think like Latin's more holier than the other languages, and their prayers need to be in Latin. And like, why do you have to go to this service where you don't even understand the prayers because it's in a dead language? And then seeing the lack of development of iconography in the West. Like, we're supposed to have this shared, first 1,000 years, but the Orthodox theology of iconography is so much more developed. I never even really knew about that in the Catholic Church. Like, going to catechism, they never really had that strong emphasis on iconography, but it makes sense. It makes sense why it's so important. Like God becoming man, and that we're all made in the image of God. The theology of the icon is so important. Mm-hmm. And then another thing about a difference between the Orthodox liturgy and then the average Catholic liturgy is that I think you talked about the Eucharist, and in the average Catholic service in Novus Ordo, they actually let lay people hand out the Eucharist, and then they just give it to people on the hand. It's just done completely irreverently. And one thing I did like about the Latin Mass is that at least there was some reverence around the Eucharist compared to the average Catholic Church, because they have it from the priest and then they would give it on the tongue. But it's just very sad to see that the Eucharist just has no reverence anymore in the Catholic Church. And it makes sense why if you look at the Pew Research, a super majority of the Catholics don't even believe in the real presence, because it's they don't treat it like that. Versus in Orthodoxy, you see how people receive it with reverence. Not a lot of people go up at a lot of the churches I've been to, and if they do, you can see that they went to confession. It's obviously something that they're taking very seriously, because the Eucharist, that's the center of worship.
For sure. And I would also say there's a feeling I've never experienced before. When I approach the altar, even for a blessing. Obviously, I'm a catechumen, so I haven't partaken in the Eucharist. But when you approach the altar, there's a clear holiness about where you're standing. Yeah. And I noticed that immediately. As soon as I noticed, and I actually was confused when I first showed up to the Orthodox Church as to why so many people sat in the front.
Yeah.
And then now it makes sense. Now I try to sit as close to the front as I can, because there's just something about the altar that emulates holiness.
Yeah. Well, whenever you get received in the church, you got to start altar serving, because it's totally to be behind the altar and see everything. It's an amazing experience. Yeah. I love doing it every Sunday. But I think you also covered a really good point, is just the living holiness within Orthodoxy that you definitely don't find in Protestantism. This idea that miracles still happen, like the myrrh-bearing icons. We have these amazing saints that are still being produced, even in modern times, with Saint Paisios, Seraphim Rose, all these amazing people. And there's lots of saints living today, and going to monasteries and seeing that this is still producing everything that we're reading about in the Bible and in this 2,000 years. It's not just something in the past, it's something that's still living.
And it's semi-frequently, it's to the point where Orthodox Christians are just kind of used to it. We have a lady at our church that I shared this on Twitter, but she's terminally ill. She was 58 pounds, and they brought her into the church. Yeah, full grown woman. She was 58 pounds, but they brought her into the church early because she was, pretty much for sure going to pass away. Wow. And they baptized her and gave her, administered the Eucharist, and she's actually starting to get better.
Wow.
After her baptism and Eucharist, which is crazy because of how dire the situation was. Yeah. So please pray for her. Yeah. As for her continued health and recovery, that she would see a full recovery. We had the funeral paid for. The church had donated all the money to pay for the funeral, and we're hoping that money can all be refunded. Hopefully the funeral is not necessary. So
what's her name?
Kayla.
Yep. Everyone pray for Kayla. Were you ever drawn to Catholicism or Orthodoxy more? Did you want one to win out more? Because some people may feel more comfortable with Catholicism because it's, it is more Western than the East. Mm-hmm. Or were you more I'm kind of neutral. I just want to see this papacy issue, since that's what Rome relies on.
So I would say that I was just as open to Eastern Catholicism as I was to Eastern Orthodoxy, because for me, as soon as I was introduced to the aesthetic of Eastern Orthodoxy, I was I fell in love immediately. Yeah. There's nothing more beautiful than Orthodoxy. Yeah. And so I was just as open to Eastern Catholicism as I was to Eastern Orthodoxy. But I'll also say, as I look back on it, and my wife would attest to this, as soon as I was introduced to Orthodoxy, there was something about it that just intrinsically I knew that this was the truth.
Yeah, definitely.
Like as soon as I was exposed to it, and I know we're going to talk about the Divine Liturgy in a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
that like just exposure to Orthodoxy, and I found this to be true on my my Instagram. I think you saw yesterday. I just randomly threw out. I was like, hey, you guys have questions about conversion and Orthodoxy and whatever, and I got within an hour I had over 100 questions, but I still have hundreds I haven't gotten a chance to answer. I mean, people like just any exposure to this thing that is half the church that most Protestants haven't even heard of. People are starving for it. And so I think that was kind of a position I was in. Yeah. So I would say there was a level where I always was drawn towards Orthodoxy, but I would like to say that I was just as open to Eastern Catholicism because of the aesthetic and that kind of stuff.